I knew something was wrong the moment my son's fiancée asked me how many bedrooms I had in my house. Not because the question itself was strange. People ask things like that. But it was the way she asked it, tilting her head just slightly, eyes moving past me toward the hallway, as if she was already measuring the walls. I let it go. I told myself I was being paranoid. I was 63 years old, recently retired after 31 years teaching high school English in Flagstaff, Arizona. And maybe I had simply spent too many years reading stories about people who wanted things that didn't belong to them. Maybe I was projecting. My son was happy. That was supposed to be enough. It wasn't enough. And by the time I understood why, I was standing in my own living room in front of 40 guests, holding a folded piece of paper my son had pressed into my hand behind his back while his fiancée was pouring wine. The note had 4 words on it. 4 words that changed everything. Mom, don't let her. Let me start from the beginning. My son Kevin turned 29 in March. He was the kind of man I had always hoped I would raise. Steady, thoughtful, a little quiet in the way his father had been before his father decided that 30 years of marriage wasn't enough and left for someone younger. Kevin worked as a civil engineer for a municipal firm. He wasn't flashy. He drove a 7-year-old truck. He called me every Sunday. He was, in all the ways that mattered, a good man. He met Leila at a work conference in Phoenix in September. She was in hospitality management, she said, coordinating events for a hotel group. She was 34, dark-haired, with the kind of easy smile that made you feel immediately comfortable, like she had known you longer than she had. Kevin brought her to Flagstaff 6 weeks after they met. I made dinner, pot roast, which is what I always make when I want someone to feel welcome, because it takes all day and it shows. Leila complimented the house before she complimented the food. That was the first thing I noticed, and I filed it away without knowing I was filing it. "This is a beautiful property," she said, standing at the kitchen window and looking out at the backyard. "How long have you lived here?" 26 years, I said. "It must be worth quite a bit now," she said, "with the market the way it's been." I smiled and said something non-committal and turned back to the stove. Kevin was setting the table. He didn't seem to have heard her, or if he did, he didn't think anything of it. I told myself the same thing. She worked in hospitality. She probably thought about property values the way I thought about sentence structure. Occupational habit. By the second visit, she had asked about the house 3 more times. Once about the square footage. Once about whether I had considered downsizing now that I was retired. Once about whether my late mother had left me anything, which she framed as gentle curiosity after I had mentioned my mother had passed 2 years before. I answered the square footage question. I redirected the others. By the 3rd visit, I stopped telling myself I was being paranoid. I should tell you what I have, because it matters to understanding what comes next. I am not wealthy in the way people mean when they say wealthy. I don't have a vacation home or a boat or a financial advisor who takes me to lunch. But I am comfortable in the way that 31 years of careful living produces. My house is paid off. A 4-bedroom Craftsman on the east side of Flagstaff that I bought with my ex-husband and kept in the divorce. My retirement pension is modest but reliable. And there is a savings account that I have built over decades, contribution by contribution, that sits at a number I don't say out loud, because my mother always told me that advertising what you have is the fastest way to lose it. Let's call it substantial. It is the product of a life lived deliberately. I had never told Kevin exactly what that number was. I told him it was enough. He never pressed me. That is the kind of son he was. What I didn't know until later was that Leila had been pressing him. Kevin told me this himself, eventually. She had asked him, casually at first, and then with more frequency, what I had put away. She framed it as practical. If they were going to plan a future together, she said, she needed to understand the full picture. Didn't Kevin think it would be wise for his mother to set up a trust? Wouldn't it make sense for me to add Kevin to the deed while I was still healthy? To avoid probate? She knew an estate attorney, she said. A friend. Very discreet. Kevin had told her he didn't think it was his place to ask me those things. He told me later that something about her insistence had begun to feel less like planning and more like inventory. Meanwhile, she was also talking to my doctor. I found this out by accident. I went to my annual checkup in November. Dr. Reyes, who I have seen for 12 years. And she mentioned, in the careful way doctors mention things they are uncertain about, that someone had called the office asking about my cognitive health. The caller had identified herself as a family member and asked whether I had shown any signs of memory issues or early dementia. Dr. Reyes had not released any information. She was bound by privacy law and also, she said, because she had found the call strange. My name is on no one's emergency contact list except Kevin's. She had called Kevin afterward to confirm he had made the inquiry. He had not. I sat in the examination room for a long moment after Dr. Reyes told me this. I looked at the paper on the table and the little model of a spine on the shelf, and I thought about Leila standing at my kitchen window, asking about property values, and everything that had seemed like individual, unconnected oddities suddenly assembled itself into a shape I recognized. She was building a case, not for love, not for a future. A case that I was declining. A case that my son's future wife needed to be considered in decisions about my estate. A case that eventually some attorney or some document or some well-placed conversation might make persuasive. I had taught literature for 31 years. I knew a plot when I saw one. I did not tell Kevin immediately. This is the part people sometimes question, and I understand why. But here is my reasoning, and I stand by it. Kevin loved her. He had been alone for a long time before her, in the quiet way that gentlemen are sometimes alone for a long time, and I was not willing to detonate his happiness on suspicion alone. I needed to be certain. I needed something he could see with his own eyes, rather than take on faith from his mother who, as Leila had perhaps calculated, was of an age where people might dismiss her instincts as anxiety. So I started paying attention the way I had never paid attention to anything except lesson plans and student essays. I kept a small notebook. I wrote down dates, conversations, questions she asked, things she said to Kevin that he later repeated to me. I noted the name of the attorney she had mentioned. I looked him up. He specialized in elder law and estate transfers. I noted the timing of her questions, which clustered around moments when Kevin was out of the room. In December, I had the locks changed. I told Kevin they were old and I had been meaning to do it. I also had a conversation with my own attorney, not a friend of Leila's, my attorney, who had handled my divorce and whom I had known for 15 years. I updated my will. I made sure my accounts had no ambiguity about beneficiaries. I transferred nothing, added no one, changed no document at Leila's suggestion or for any reason connected to her. I made my house a fortress on paper before she ever thought to try the door. And then I waited. The engagement came in February. Kevin called me on a Thursday evening, and I could hear the happiness in his voice, that particular brightness that had not been there for years, and I felt the pull of it, the desire to be happy for him, simply and without complication. I told him congratulations. I meant it, and I also didn't mean it, and the space between those two things kept me awake that night. They wanted an engagement party at my house. Leila suggested it. Of course she did. I said yes. I said yes because I had been waiting for an opportunity that felt like this, and because I had spent 3 months gathering information that I now needed to know what to do with. And because I understood by then that whatever Leila's plan was, it would accelerate after an engagement. The attorney conversations, the deed, the accounts, these were things a fiancé might raise with social acceptability that a girlfriend could not. Time was now part of the equation. I called Kevin's aunt, my sister-in-law Patricia, who had stayed close after the divorce because she always said the falling out was between me and her brother and had nothing to do with her. Patricia was a retired paralegal. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is a skill very few people have. "Do you want to know if she's done this before?" Patricia asked when I finished. I said yes. Patricia knew people. She had spent 30 years in legal offices and had the kind of professional network that I had always quietly admired. It took her 2 weeks. What she found was not a criminal record. Leila had no criminal record. What she found was a name. A man named Gerald, 68 years old, retired contractor, living in Tucson. He had been engaged to a woman matching Leila's description, different name, 2 years before. The engagement had ended when his adult children intervened. He had quietly transferred a sum of money during the relationship under circumstances his daughter described, when Patricia reached her by phone, as pressure she still didn't fully understand. Gerald's daughter was named Yvonne. I called her myself. She answered on the second ring. She was 41. She had her father's power of attorney now, because in the year after the relationship ended, Gerald had experienced what his doctors called a significant depressive episode. He was better now, she said, but he was different. She told me things. She told me about the questions about the property and the suggestions about the estate attorney and the quiet campaign to establish Gerald's family as interfering and overcautious, so that when Yvonne raised concerns, Gerald would be primed to dismiss them. She told me her father had not wanted to believe it until he couldn't unbelieve it anymore. I told her I was sorry. I told her about Kevin. She told me if I needed her, she would come. I planned the engagement party for the first Saturday in March. 40 guests. My sister, Kevin's friends from college and from work, a few neighbors. I made food from scratch because I always make food from scratch, and because having something to do with my hands in the days before kept me from climbing the walls. On the Tuesday before the party, something shifted with Kevin. He called me in the evening, and there was something in his voice that I recognized, a held quality, like a word you aren't certain you should say. We talked about the party for a few minutes, and then he went quiet. "Mom," he said, "can I ask you something?" "Always," I said. "Has Leila talked to you about the house?" I paused. "What do you mean?" "She said she mentioned to you that it might make sense to add me to the deed. She said you seemed open to it." I had never seemed open to it. I had never discussed it with her directly, which meant she had told Kevin a version of a conversation that had not happened. "We can talk about all of that after the party," I said carefully. "Okay?" He agreed, but when we hung up, I sat for a long time at my kitchen table in the quiet of my own house. I thought about everything I had built here. The mortgage paid off, dollar by dollar. The savings account that represented not wealth, but 31 years of choosing the practical thing, the sensible thing, the patient thing. I thought about Kevin's face on Sunday dinners, the way he had grown up in these rooms. I thought about Gerald in Tucson, who was different now. The party was on a Saturday afternoon. Leila arrived 40 minutes early, which I had expected. She moved through my house in a way I watched very carefully, touching things lightly, opening the cabinet under the kitchen island on the pretext of looking for a serving bowl. I told her where the serving bowls were. She smiled at me with all her teeth. The guests arrived. Kevin was happy in the way that made me ache a little, genuinely and without performance. He poured wine. He told the story of how they met. He looked at Leila the way I had hoped someone would look at him. I had invited Yvonne. I had told Kevin I had invited a former colleague. She arrived at 4:15, a compact woman with steady eyes and her father's contractor hands, and I introduced her to no one in particular and seated her in the living room with a glass of sparkling water. At 4:45, Kevin came to find me in the kitchen while Leila was across the room talking to my neighbor. He came up beside me as if he were helping me with the cheese plate. Without looking at me, he pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand. Then he stepped back and busied himself with the crackers. I unfolded it under the counter's edge. "Mom, don't let her." I found something. I looked up at him. He gave me the smallest nod. My hands were steady. I had been a teacher for 31 years. I had learned to be steady when students were watching. I came out of the kitchen with the cheese plate and set it on the dining table. And then I picked up a butter knife and tapped it against my glass, the way people do when they are about to make a toast. The room settled. "I want to say a few things," I began, as Kevin's mother, and as the person who has lived in this house for 26 years and worked for 31 and tried in all of that time to be worthy of the things I was trusted with. Leila smiled at me from across the room. It was a warm prospective daughter-in-law smile. She did not know yet. "Leila," I said, "I understand you called my doctor's office in November, asking about my cognitive health, identifying yourself as a family member." The smile didn't disappear immediately. It took about 2 seconds, which is longer than you might expect, which told me something about her composure. "I don't know what—" "I have a woman here tonight," I said, "whose father spent 2 years with someone who asked the same questions about his property that you have asked about mine, who suggested the same estate attorney, who told him his family was being overprotective right up until he had transferred enough that it mattered." Yvonne stood up from her chair near the window. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Leila looked at Yvonne. She looked at me. She looked at Kevin, who was standing very still near the dining table with his arms at his sides, and something passed across his face that I cannot describe except to say that it was the expression of a man understanding something he had been trying not to understand. "I have documentation," I said, "of every conversation about my property. My attorney has copies. I have the records of the call to my doctor. I have a signed statement from Yvonne regarding her father, which she has provided voluntarily." The room was very quiet. 40 people, and you could hear the refrigerator. "I love my son," I said. "I have loved him for 29 years, which is longer than I have loved almost anything. What is in this house, and what is in my accounts, is his inheritance. In time, in the way that inheritances are meant to work, which is after I am gone and not before. It is not a resource to be accessed through a marriage. It is not a transaction." Leila said my name once, sharply, and then appeared to decide that was a mistake. "I think," I said, looking at her directly, "that you should leave." She left. She took her coat from the hook by the door, and she left without looking at Kevin, which told me everything I needed to know about how much she had loved him. Kevin didn't speak for a long time. The guests began to quietly collect their things. My sister came and stood near me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her. Patricia, who had driven down from Sedona for the party, caught my eye from across the room and gave me a slow nod. Later, after everyone else was gone, Kevin and I sat at my kitchen table with cups of tea going cold between us. The house was quiet in the way it gets after a gathering, full of the echo of people who have just been there. How long did you know? He asked. Since November, I said, when she called the doctor. He was quiet for a moment. I found the attorney's paperwork, he said, in her bag, by accident. She had drafted something, transferring consulting fees for estate planning from an account in my name. He looked at his hands. I didn't understand it at first. Then I did. I reached across and covered his hand with mine. We sat like that for a while. He filed a police report the following week on the advice of Patricia and my attorney. Yvonne's father submitted a statement regarding his own experience, which he gave with the specific and quiet courage of someone who had waited a long time to be believed. I don't know what came of the investigation. These things move slowly, and my attorney tells me to be patient. What I know is this. My house is mine. My savings are mine. My son is sitting across from me on Sunday evenings again, the way he has since he was old enough to drive himself here. And there is nothing in his voice now except the ordinary, unheld quality of a man who is all right. I am 63 years old. I am a retired English teacher. I spent my career handing students stories and asking them to find what was true inside them. The thing I always told them is the thing I kept telling myself through all of those months when I was watching and waiting and writing things in a small notebook. Pay attention. The story is always telling you something. The only question is whether you are willing to listen before it is too late. I listened. And I kept what was mine, not just the house, not just the accounts. My son, my judgment, the life I had built room by room, year by year, in the ordinary and irreplaceable way that a life gets built. Nobody takes that from me. Nobody ever will.